Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next Olive Tree Media webinar for 2023. We're really excited that you've decided to join us for this webinar, where Karl Faase will be joined by Karen Wilson live. And we're going to look at the topic of women in ministry and work. And we're going to try and confront the question of, is there a stained glass ceiling? But we're not just hearing from Karen today. I sat down a few weeks ago and I spoke with Stephanie Judd, who's Director of Ministry at City on a Hill. And I also spoke with Wendy Simpson, OAM, about her experience in corporate in various sectors. And she's a company director. And both these women sort of have lived experience of leadership. And it's going to be great to hear their perspectives and hear Karen's thoughts and perspectives as well on this topic. And we're really glad you've joined us. So we'd like to welcome you from every home, every office, every church, every school, every boardroom or lunchroom, right across Australia and beyond. We're really glad you've joined us. And we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you're all joining from. And we praise God for them and the lands, and our Almighty Creator God for his stewardship throughout generations. Now, we have a chat on the right-hand side, and we would love for you to say hello. Let us know where you're from. And just so you know that later on there will be a Q&A, and you'll have the opportunity to put your questions in, and we'll select a few of those, and Karl and Karen will join. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Karl Faase to this webinar as the host, and we'll get started.
So, Ainsley, thanks for your introduction, and Karl Faase here as the thorn among the roses, and looking forward to speaking with them today and looking at this really significant issue. As Ainsley said, there's a chat on the right. I've noticed there's people here: Adelaide, Toowoomba, Kyogle, Brisbane, Darwin, and there's Adelaide Hills, Gold Coast, even Auckland. So fabulous that you've joined us, and this is going to be a wonderful time together. Coming in live today is Karen Wilson from Western Australia. She's there in Perth, enjoying a great day. Karen, welcome to the webinar today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I even had a message last night. Sri Lanka's tuning in as well. So I think this has gone truly global, Karl.
Yeah, and for those of you who watch and think, gee, I'd love my friends to see this, it's a shame they missed it. Keep in mind, you can watch, if they link into registering for it, there's the opportunity to watch a replay. Karen, what do you do? Give us a picture of what you do.
What do I do? Well, at the moment, I'm the CEO of the Global Leadership Network here in Australia and New Zealand. That's part of my work. I also have an international role across the globe, overseeing this very topic, Women Leader Network launching, and Next Gen and Asia Pacific. And then I have a volunteer role as the president of the Baptist World Alliance Women. So life is rich, it's full, yes. I'm loving it. It's it's a really great season.
Yeah, and Karen, just for people to know that, you know, while you're in those very significant roles on a global setting, you also led local churches, didn't you, with your husband, Mark, there in Perth, and then I don't know how to say this, in your own right as a leader in another local church, large church in Perth. So that's leadership in a local church has been your experience, hasn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you know what? I'm a mum. I'm also a new grandma, so they call me Mimi. I've got 2 little baby grandchildren. So there's another leadership role as well. I don't think you ever get away from those.
And we appreciate you haven't shown the grandchildren photos yet, but that's fabulous. Isn't that wonderful? So it's really good to have you here, Karen, because it's a real mix of roles that you are in. As Ainsley said, she talked to Stephanie and to Wendy, and they give. We're going to see 3 videos from them. And the first is an introduction to Stephanie and to Wendy and some of their background, some of what you just heard from Karen. So here's an introduction to Stephanie and to Wendy.
My role at the moment is Director of Ministry and based in City on a Hill, Melbourne, which is our flagship church for our movement of churches. And so it's a broad term for a lot of different things. I supervise a number of our staff of different ministry areas.
There's been some really major shifts in society and major shifts in the industries that I've worked in. And when those shifts have come, I've been able to get in and have a go at making some of the changes. And so I was a political advisor for Joan Kerner, and there was a lot of changes happening in Melbourne. I've also brought the internet to China. That was obviously a major technology change. And I was the first woman to run freight operations at TNT, the air freight company. And so, yeah, all those are varied. And I guess the common theme with all of those is that when there's a change in an industry dynamic, that's often when your non-traditional leaders can get a chance to show what they're made of.
I thought I really want to play my part in the church. I love teaching. I'd love to do more of that. I'd love to be grounded in a church. And particularly, I think as a woman, I was already seeing that I wasn't seeing that many other women in leadership in churches, and really wanted to contribute in that space. So I made the call to make a shift and to move into ministry.
You know, there's a very interesting group that most people probably haven't heard of called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I was really impressed with this group of Christian women who were the pioneers to get women the vote in Australia. And so I read up about those women, and they said, you know, women have got a key responsibility in society to drive change. So I was reading their material since I was 14 years old. So I thought that that was actually part of being a Christian, was to drive change, was to be at the forefront, was to question, do we have the society we want, or do we want to make it better?
When I started, I was the first theologically trained woman on staff. And part of what I was seeing, I'm like, hey, every so often on Sunday, I'm like, hey, how come we've got no women up front? And it's like, oh yeah, how come we have no women up front? And wow, like, well, why don't every week we'll have a woman like service leading or giving a devotion or, you know, working alongside our men up front. And so now, like 6 years later, it's crazy to think that there was a time where sometimes we wouldn't have a woman up front. Like, that's like seems a different world away. So in 6 years, the culture has really grown, and we have a whole stack of women on staff.
When there's a project that needs a little bit extra, if you're a woman and you put your hand up and say, you know, I think I could do that, I can see there's a little bit extra that needs to be done, and you volunteer, you bring that out, and then you demonstrate that you can do those things. I think that often goes down very well. I mean, there's, you know, obviously you've got to be wise about it, but I hope that was something that I definitely did. I mean, there was, you know, a few examples where I walked out of a meeting and I happened to be passing by the photocopier back in the days when that was a major task around the office. And this man who I'd never seen before handed me some papers, said, photocopy these now for me. And I just looked at him and said, well, I'm just actually in a meeting now, so I won't be doing that for you. You know, so they just assume, well, if you're a woman and you need the photocopy, that's your job. I thought, well, no, not actually.
And I think, well, like I'm a woman who has 2 young children, and I've greatly appreciated just having a husband who, like, we both work 4 days a week. So it's this massive juggle, this game of Tetris to try and make this work, where we're both, you know, active in our parenting and also contributing in church and work. But I'm seeing more and more models like that. I think it takes often also men who are willing to adopt flexible models for themselves and with their families, for that then also to become more understood and applicable for women as well. Now it's both a learning stage, I think, for women to say there are these opportunities now, and praising God for that and stepping into that, but also recognizing it's okay to be limited. You know, it's okay to make choices. Sometimes it's okay to make choices to work less or be in some spaces if you want to spend more time with family. It's okay to, you know, seek the care and support that you need if there are certain spaces that you want to be in. You know, just to understand that we can't actually be everywhere, and that if we're going to serve well in all the spaces of our life, thinking how can we do this well, so that to make sure that holistically we're well, mentally, physically, and drawing on the help of those around us to do that.
Well, what a fantastic video and great insights from Wendy and from Stephanie. Karen, you got to love a little phrase like, I brought the internet to China.
I know, just a small achievement, really. That was awesome.
And then juxtaposed with that is walking past the photocopier, and some bloke, it's always a bloke, says, "Can you photocopy this?" Karen, have you ever had that sort of experience in any of your settings?
You know, as she said that just then, I was reminded I was sitting on a board, and it was a new board that we were forming. And so we all kind of sat around with mates. It was like, let's get friends together and run this thing. And it was like, well, who's going to be the secretary of the board? Now, you don't want me being, I can do admin, but honestly. And so everyone looks at me and I'm like, don't look at me. I'm like, just because I'm the woman. So this other guy who's a really dear friend of mine, he goes, I'll be the secretary, you be the vice chair. I'm like, awesome, that sounds great. But it was literally that moment that where everyone just looked, well, you're a woman, you can be the secretary of the board. And I'm just like, it is the past. I'm not sure it's as much now, but yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, that kind of casual sexism just kind of leaks into all organisations. Do you think it's more of a problem for the church than it is in other settings?
Look, I think we're trying to catch up. I think the world has shouted loudly in the last decade through all sorts of movements. I think the church has been forced into making some decisions and having conversations. I think we're great at culture in the church. When culture's good, it's what makes us who we are. But when it's bad, it's really hard to change it. So because our leaders change so often, don't they? Often pastors will come and go, and depending on the leader.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe it's not better or worse, but it definitely is a problem.
Because on this webinar, and we've chatted to Karen, and Stephanie will mention this a little, we didn't want this to be a long discussion about theological positions, but interestingly, theology does sort of come into it a bit, doesn't it, Karen? And you're dealing with different theological positions, which impacts how people see women in leadership.
Yeah, it does. And, you know, I think in that space, I always say you just have to have grace for one another. If you're going to try and out-argue each other, you're just never going to win. And plus, it's the wrong posture to start with. If you come at this issue with a combative stance, then you're going to get a combative response. So I'm just like, what if there was grace for the conversations where we just allow room to be able to move a little bit more than we've maybe moved in the past?
Do you see the combative stance very often? Because I tend to see that every now and then in different spaces. And there's always this mixture, Karen, I think, from my perspective as a leader, as a male, that, so you can discount what I'm saying, that on the idea of, it's a shame you're so angry, but then there's every reason to be angry. And does it work? And give us some feelings on that for you.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I haven't had a terrible experience in this space. Yes. So I'm just going to acknowledge that out of the hundreds that are watching right now, there's probably many women who have really suffered. I can't say suffer would be an adequate word to describe my journey. I've walked alongside a man, a husband, who literally has been very releasing and makes this his mission in life to release women in leadership. And I've been part of boards and organizations now with the Global Leadership Network. We're egalitarian. But the fact is, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of hurt. I think there are spaces for us to deal with that and talk about that. I don't think it should be hidden. I don't think it should be smothered. But in the right places, I actually think, Karl, it's really tough for you guys to be able to deal with it for us. We have to deal with it with one another and for ourselves.
Yeah, all the men watching are appreciating you allowing us off the hook, which is probably more generous and gracious than you should be. Give us a global perspective, Karen. I mean, what do you're interacting with leaders across the world? If you want to give a mark for how Australia's going as a church, as a leadership culture, is there a way of giving us a reflection on that?
Yeah, you know, most of my work is happening with the developing countries around the world. So if we compare ourselves to that, then we would come out shining, I'm sure. But that's not the point. I think we need to compare ourselves with where we want to be as well as a country, and where we want to be in the future and where we've come from. So I think globally there's a challenge. I think the world is waking up and speaking about this. I think in developing nations, women are secretly asking, am I a leader? Can I have a voice? There are women that are veiled, that are still leaders behind veils. And so the challenge is for them to find out in their context how they do that.
Yeah.
So when we talk about women leaders globally, every single city and definitely country and region is very different how they approach it.
Yeah.
I guess the one word, Karl, I'd want to put out there is freedom. Pretty sure as followers of Jesus, we've been called to live in freedom and to live the John 10:10 life, in all of its abundance.
Yeah.
Well, to me, if you're a leader, then that means then you lead in freedom as well, and you have space to move and space to grow and acceptance and respect in that space.
Yeah. We're going to get some comments now from Wendy and Stephanie as well as Ainsley talk to them. And this is about the barriers and obstacles. And then a little bit later, they're going to go on and talk about some of the ways forward, the paths forward. We're going to interact with Karen on that as well. So here's the second video with Stephanie and Wendy talking about the barriers and obstacles for women in leadership.
Obviously, in the era that I was starting to develop my career, particularly Christian women were sort of suggested that maybe, in the nursing, the caring professions, education, etc. And whilst they were very interesting, I wanted to do something just a bit more edgy. And I guess I got that from the way that I read the Bible, that we are there to change, we're there to steward, from the very creation story where God's created the world, he's created us in his image. And if God's creative and dynamic, then, I believe that I'm dynamic and creative. So I guess I had that. So I was prepared to put my hand up. One
for me is the recognition that, well, first working out what I believe, that was really important. And that wasn't like an immediate, it wasn't like as soon as I became a Christian that like all the theology in this space was clear. So, and I had some nights where I was like sleepless nights where I was up at night recognizing that wherever I landed on these issues of what it looks like to be a woman in ministry and the church and how that plays out, that's going to impact the rest of my life and ministry. Yeah. And I think one of the unique challenges of that is recognizing that is different as a woman. So, if I change my view about, say, what I believe about a woman preaching on a Sunday, then that actually impacts whether I'm on the roster the next week or not. Like, skin in the game, and that is something that's different for, I think, my brothers in ministry. And so just to recognize that and to work to be at peace with that, but also to do the work and to be willing to make changes and to God's leading in that. I'd encourage, women listening who, seeking being in ministry, to spend that time to really work hard in understanding, what do I believe about myself, my place in the church? I'd have to say that in most, not all, but in most circumstances, the Christian community is behind what society's doing. And the Christian women leaders, the very senior women who are on boards, who are in vice president roles, CEO roles, would say to me that as they've gone through their professional career, they've been expected to step up, they've expected to take on leadership roles. They've had people mentoring actively and forecasting them. Look, in 3 years' time, I see you doing this. In 5 years' time, I see you doing it. And yet they say very sadly that in some churches still, if they are new to the church, people will say, oh, that's very nice. Thank you for coming to our church. Now, look, we do have a roster for the tea and coffee. I'm just wondering if you would volunteer for that. They never assume that, they could be leading marketplace ministry, or, we've got a seat on the board, which, probably, in the first week you go to a church, you shouldn't be put on their board. But, they don't assume that the woman's going to bring some professional skills, some high level skills. And so there's this strange disconnect, which I want to be a Christian. I want to live my life. I want to have that fulfillment of having a vocation. I want to see that God is integrated in everything I do. And then they go to a Christian group and people say, oh, she's got a lot to say, hasn't she? Seems to be sort of wanting to get involved in a lot of things. What's all that about? So, that persona that women have been told is great and fabulous to have in their professional life is often misunderstood in the church. And I think that's really sad. I think that probably came as a surprise, just that by very nature of being a woman in ministry, you're rubbing against a whole host of different views and perspectives. So being prepared for that, I think, is important, and being willing to kind of ride that wave is the journey that I'm on.
Wow, Karen, there's a remarkable set of statements there, and interesting. Just want to start for a sec. I'm going to get on to having a lot to say, because I know that's never been said of you. But that notion from Wendy about the advice given to women for their future leadership roles, and it's often the caring roles, and anybody watching this is in a caring role, good on you. This is not about that. But it's an interesting reflection from Wendy about where you're steered.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with the place that we hold alongside men. So the advice given, look, I've actually had it said to me in a ministry role that I was in, Karen, can you just be less? And I'm just like, oh, okay, less than what? And just, I think it was less than the man that was asking me the question. And I said, do you have an idea of how much less you'd like me to be? And he did. He said 50%. So I'm like, whoa, okay, and I mean, I'm saying it quite lightly here, but at the time it was really confronting. It actually meant whether I stayed in that role or not. And he was actually saying everything you do is just gets too big. But I thought, you know what? I feel like if there was a man in that space, they'd be cheering him on to take over the world. You're probably not surprised, but my answer was no, I can't. I'm literally going to stand before God and say I did all I could with everything you asked me to do and everything in every way you created me. But we are asked to be quiet. We're asked to be small. We're asked to be less than. It's about where our fit is alongside men. Now, with men who are comfortable and they're confident in their space, I don't think I'd ever be asked that. Karl, I don't think you'd ever ask me, Karen, please be less. Because we'd have to have a really strong chalk if you did, but it's not your posture. So I think for us to find our space, it's literally quite difficult, but it depends on what men are in the room as well.
Yeah. I mean, you've told that story and kind of made light of it, but devastating at the time?
Totally. It took me 2 years to get over it.
Wow.
I literally walked around the river near our house and literally had to pray that through. But that's quite a while ago now. And, in this season I'm in, where you asked me what I do, I just think, what if I'd said yes to being less? Yeah. What if I'd literally just shown up in a smaller way? What if I didn't use my voice when God asked me to? I certainly wouldn't be in this space I am now. So I think, honestly, if we can tough through those hard times, we grow. We learn from the bad as well as the good. And many women here today will say that years of pain have literally either strengthened them or broken them. And my prayer is that it strengthens us because we need men and women leading well together.
Totally. I mean, I'm coming to what Stephanie said a minute ago, but Wendy's comment, give us some your thoughts on this. Wendy's comment about women in senior leadership roles, and we even see it in the government. I mean, the present Albanese government has federally has a very high percentage of women in key leadership roles. Many of our large, both government instrumentalities and also corporations are run by women. The new CEO of Qantas is going to be a woman, but her comment was that, when you get to a church setting, one of our problems is, there's a spot on the roster for tea and coffee. I mean, how do we help people past that?
Yeah, I think her context was about driving change too, wasn't it, Karl? Where she said women drive change, and in those senior leadership roles, if we want community changed, if we want our culture changed, women will be the drivers of that. I wonder about our appetite for change in churches. I feel like I just dropped that one there. So perhaps a lot of churches are very comfortable with where they are, and a voice that will bring change may be just as confronting as it being a female voice. Super interesting. I was speaking yesterday to the head of World Vision in Africa. It's part of my role, and they're looking at rolling out women leaders networks right across Africa. And I said to him, his name's Daniel, I said, Daniel, why do you think it's important for women to be in leadership across the African continent? And I'm going to tell you these 4 things. I haven't run these past you beforehand, so I hope you're okay with this. This is from Daniel and not from me. He said to me, and I quote, "Women are more committed to projects than men, and they follow through with their commitments. Women are able to draw others, the next gen, and men to work alongside them." He says women have a higher spirituality than men and involve prayer and community in all they do. Women have relationally higher commitment and work together more deeply for a cause. And I think you could just put agents of change across all of those. And you probably want to challenge all of them at some level, because I think you also do a lot of that. But what he was saying was there's this strength that women bring, and he goes, it's untapped in Africa. I'm going to say it's untapped in most of the world. And he was eager to draw it out and to lift it up.
Yeah, I know some international aid organisations. Now, this is a very different setting, but it's an interesting reflection that they will work with the women in the community, not the men in the community. So if they're giving a micro loan, it will be to the women, not the men, which is an indictment on pretty much all male listening. But it's a huge challenge. Stephanie's point about having almost the dark night of the soul, though she didn't use those terms, lying awake at night, thinking about her own theological position. And recognizing that it wasn't just a theory and a kind of an idea, it would actually impact what she goes on to do. That's intriguing concept, isn't it?
It is, and it gets down to our calling. So are women less called than men by God for an assignment on this planet? I don't think so. So what she was doing was searching through her theology to match her calling as well. She said 6 years earlier, she arrived on staff and didn't see anyone like herself, but felt called to step into that space and to make a difference. 6 years later, it's very, very different. I've done the same. I think when I look back on my life as a little girl, I was leading everything. I was a prefect at school and school captain and Christian fellowship leader. And when Mark and I just were talking about getting married, we both just said, we both feel called to ministry. How would that look for us? It was part of our romantic conversation before we actually got engaged. So then you literally have to search scripture and say, did God make a mistake when he made me a leader and he made me a woman? My answer is no, but then you've got to reconcile that for the rest of your life.
The wonderful thing about Stephanie's reflections on that and what she said, as you said, 6 years before there was nobody on leadership, and because she's at City on a Hill, and that's for those around Australia or abroad know of City on a Hill, they have a more conservative complementarian view on leadership, and yet she's grown to a very key leadership role. So it's not like, therefore, if you have that view, it's the tea and coffee roster for you. There's still plenty of opportunity, and that you would see that globally.
Yeah, totally. I think in many nations too, it's culturally and politically unacceptable for women to lead. I had one country, I won't name them, come up to me when I was traveling overseas, and one of the young women just said to me, "Do you think it's possible that we could be leaders in our nation?" And I said, "Do you think God made you a leader?" And she whispered and she goes, "Yes." And I said, "Well, then I think it's possible." She goes, "I'm going to start a group." And so she starts this group in the capital city of that country. They had 12 young women come together, and they met for coffee and did a whole session in the morning. They met again 3 months later, 40 women. They got plans in a few weeks' time to gather 100 women. It just takes one to have the courage to think, I wonder if it's possible. And no matter, even in cultures where females are shut down, God's still at work. And he's still asking us just to step into those spaces and find a way that's possible. And it's happened down through history.
Yeah. It is interesting, isn't it, politically, that some of the nations around the world that are seen as not open to women in leadership have had more prime ministers as women than America, who still hasn't had one, which is kind of a little odd, isn't it, really? Here's these cultures that would seemingly squash women. Is it just, in those cohorts where you're seeing women encouraging women, is it just encouraging women? Is there men and women together that they're leading, or is there a space where women just need to have someone that they look up to and encourage them?
I think all of the above, Karl. So in the cohorts that I'm launching globally, we basically are identifying women. Because to be honest, if I asked you to name 10 leaders that you knew, Karl, you'd probably 8 of them would be men. Because you're a man. It's just who our sphere of connection is. So it's identifying, it's equipping them, it's empowering them, it's releasing them, it's networking them. so that they have an impact. There's the whole 6 points, and I can rattle it off. But it's literally the first and last, identifying for impact. That's the thing. I think you get women leaders together, they want to do something. If you tell us to have a cup of tea and coffee and just sit in that space, I mean, that's part of it, but we want to actually be mobilized for good, and we want to make a difference. It's basically innately who we are. So I think when we start to see that and we equip and empower, and in my world, I'm having men champion this even more than women. So that's exciting. They're funding it, they're resourcing it, they're saying it's time, let's go. So it's quite a thrilling season for me.
That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. We're actually going to show a little trailer. It goes for a couple of minutes for Faith Runs Deep, just to let you know what's out there. Wendy actually mentioned earlier in her first talk about being inspired by the suffragettes and those who actually, for the Christian women's temperance movement in South Australia actually were a key to seeing the vote come to South Australia second after New Zealand. And often the temperance movement is seen as, wowsers, killjoys. They were women who wanted to make a difference and actually shifted the needle in the politics of our nation. This series actually has numbers of women in the series, and this is just a look at Faith Runs Deep. Stories matter. Stories are important. They tell us where we've come from. They remind us about what is valuable. They help clarify our future.
I thought, I don't care what it costs me, I'm going to see what these guys have got that I haven't got.
It was as if I saw for the first time, this is what Jesus is like.
I went to church with my new friend Lisa, and I heard the gospel. I heard about Jesus.
In Faith Runs Deep, we will discover stories of faith from history and today, of people with deep personal faith who have profoundly shaped this nation.
Australia lives off Christian capital to this day.
One day I heard this thump and there was a tree and it just fell over. It had rotted out right underneath. That's something that I don't think we want to see happen to our culture, because the deep roots of Christianity, they're really critical for the health of the nation.
Join us on this journey as we discover where faith runs deep in Australia. So there's Faith Runs Deep, our new series that we released last year, and has a number of women within the series. And we talked about the suffragettes. Karen, this is a question without notice, so I apologise already. Now she's nervous. You're going to be an example for lots of women as they watch this webinar, as they see what you're doing with the Global Leadership Network. Were there women who were inspirational for you that you looked at and thought, I want to be like that? Or did you find yourself having to just pioneer a track of your own?
You know what? They're limited for me, Karl. I'm in my late 50s. And when I look ahead to women in their late 60s and 70s, these conversations we're having today are really only starting today. So it is limited, although I remember sitting at a Global Leadership Summit and watching Carly Fiorina. She was the head of Hewlett Packard in the USA, and she was unjustly dismissed, in her words. She had some advice to give women leaders, and that was profound for me. And perhaps this example you and I shared that was quite a traumatic season of my life. I remember Carly looking down the camera and just saying, I made a decision, because she'd come home and she'd wept and wept and wept. And she said, I will not waste my tears on things that do not matter. Now, for me, as a little bit of an emotional person, I'm like, I will not waste my tears. Okay. So I've learned from mentors who don't even know me. I've watched my own mum, and she has stood alongside my father in a very different setting where women weren't allowed to step into spaces of leadership, yet she's led everything. She was, doing everything as a pastor's wife. And that's all I wanted to be when I grew up. My goal at 13 years of age was to be a pastor's wife, because it's the only context of leadership that I even had.
Yeah.
And I willingly stepped into that. And then the world starts opening up and I start seeing there's more, and I just keep saying yes and stepping into greater spaces. But I'd say I've had some great role models personally, but I'm hoping that we can now model for the next generation and mentor those that are coming through, and there won't be a void.
Yeah. So looking at the future, thank you. I really appreciate your thoughts there. Our third video is from Wendy and from Stephanie, and they're looking at overcoming the barriers. What are the ways forward? What should we do next? Here's Wendy Simpson and Stephanie Judd.
What do you see works in terms of empowering women into leadership across the spectrum of theological positions?
I think number one is having women, at least one woman, ideally two or more, in your church, in your team, who are leading and are examples to other women of what it looks like for a woman to lead. I think the other thing too is for men or women who are in positions of power and leadership, taking ownership of this as part of their ministry to empower women, like not just leaving it to women to empower women, particularly where there's cultural change that's desired. And I think starting early in the pipelines, what I've seen across the board, whether it's churches or like Christian organizations or theological colleges, whatever it might be, that there is now positively an awakening in this area. Like, yeah, we need more women on our board, on our exec team, or in partnership, or, you know, our faculty, or whatever it might be. So where are these women? And some of the challenges that, well, firstly, I want to say that there are a lot of these women out there, so keep searching if it's not immediately clear to you. But the other thing is that, you know, if there aren't women with the expertise around that you're looking for, I think it's a sign that actually we need to start earlier in the pipeline. Having excellent people investing in youth and young adults, putting them on the front lines of ministry earlier, training, recruiting them, men and women, because that's going to be our next generation of leaders.
I talk about planting your own trees. I think one of the challenges for Christian organisations is that often they don't do anything to develop the women leaders. And then they look around, you know, the accounting profession, the legal profession, and they say, oh, look at that woman there. She's got some very interesting skills. And they say, oh, we'll just go and invite her to be part of our organisation. I'd say, well, you know, that's eating someone else's fruit. You haven't done anything in your own organisation. You haven't been building up leadership pathways for your own young women. So I don't think that's appropriate. So I actually call it eating someone else's fruit. So plant your own trees.
What advice would you give someone, a younger version of you?
Well, firstly, for women in ministry, like, keep going. The church needs you. God's given you gifts. He's given you experiences. And we see from the Bible, regardless of where you stand on the kind of complementarian, egalitarian front, that God has designed men and women in unity to serve on his mission. And so if you're not contributing, then the church has a limp. It's missing out. So the church needs you. Keep going. I think I also want to say that particularly for some women who might be feeling isolated or alone, or like the one woman in a male-dominant environment, is that you're not alone. There are lots of women out there who are supporting you, cheering you on, pleased that you're doing what you're doing, experiencing a lot of the same things that you are, and just good to remember that, and actually to draw on other women who can support you, pray for you, and also to draw on, you know, good male friends who will champion you and support you in what you're doing. I think that is really key.
Bronnie Scott, who is the female lead of Winona School, what she said was any woman who's way over sort of 45 should be considering who to mentor, and she said, don't underestimate the role that you can play. And I mean, very sadly, there's quite a number of marriage breakdowns now, and so having like a consistent, strong, competent female in a lot of young people's lives, that isn't there now because of the breakdown of marriages and society. So I think we've got something to offer. And what she said was that young people absolutely love it, love being that special person that's being, you know, given that investment of time and encouragement.
I think I'd also say be prepared in your ministry career, maybe for the next 5 years. I'm hoping it's less for the future generations than it is for me, but be prepared to talk about the women's stuff. I never went into ministry thinking I want to be a champion for women and be talking about women's in ministry all the time. I'm like, I want to teach the Bible, and can I do a sermon on the Gospel of John? But what I have found is that when being in ministry in this space, and when navigating change, and that does come, and so just be prepared for that. It'll be a journey, might be a journey to make peace with that, but I'd encourage you to do that. But also, don't disregard and don't stop focusing on the reasons that you go into ministry in the first place. Keep coming back to those foundationals. For me, it was that now is the time of salvation. Now is the time of God's patience. God will return. Jesus will return. One day he's going to bring his church with him. And he needs workers for the harvest field, and you can be that worker. So keep coming back to that, drinking from that well of living water that is going to sustain you in challenging times and in joyful times. Keep going deep with Jesus. That's just the most important piece.
So there's some remarkable material in there, Karen. And we've also got some questions coming through. Remember, there's questions on the chat. We're not going to get it too many because Karen and I both talk too much. And thank you to Ainsley for doing those interviews with Wendy and Stephanie. Just some great comments in all of that for us. Also want to mention especially Margaret, who's just put on love, faith runs deep. Margaret, clearly a woman of great insight. But on that we've just been said, here's that notion, Wendy, where Wendy said, plant your own trees, don't eat other people's fruit. What's your thoughts on that, Karen?
I love that. That's going to be what I quote in 10 years' time when someone says, what was a nugget that you've just learned in the last decade? Because it talks about intentionality. It talks about you've got to go and work out what that tree is you're going to plant. I guess, honestly, it's where I'm at right now, Karl. A few years ago, in fact, I wonder if we can put this image up. A few years ago, God woke me up in the middle of the night, and he gave me a vision. Now, I've never had this before or since. I was so compelled by this particular vision, which is probably on your screen now, I'm trusting, that I found an artist in my city. And I said, would she pray and see if she got the same vision? And she did. And she painted this image for me. And it literally shows these women standing around the coastline. Well, that's our city in Perth. That's our river flowing down to Fremantle. But anywhere I show this image, I could leave it on the screen for half an hour, and everybody, even on this, in this webinar, would be able to tell you something different. But what it shows is strength of women standing together with the next generation. So they're planting trees to bring the others. There's a little girl, 3 up from the bottom, who is one that we actually partner with, Destiny Rescue, an organisation in Australia. And I see that little girl as being one of the little children that they rescue. And so there's this sense of standing in a space, God calling. And, I prayed through that image that I received. It's sitting here above my desk, even as I'm speaking now, and felt like God said, start planting those trees. This is what you'll do. Now, if you want to get specific, I felt like he told me the next decade of my life would be devoted to this.
Wow.
So then when opportunities come for leadership, for the roles that I'm in, they were pretty easy yeses when they said, we want to launch a women leaders network globally. I'm like, pretty sure that was the tree God told me to plant.
Yeah.
If you asked me to go and be a lecturer at some Bible college, I'd probably say no, because it's not my tree to plant. Once you know what it is that's in your hand to be planted for the generations to come, your yes becomes easier and your no becomes easier as well.
Interestingly, because one of the things that Stephanie said there was make sure whatever organisation, and to be frank, whatever theological position you hold, there's 1 or 2 or 3 people in leadership positions that are women. That's important, that whole planting people into leadership positions. You can do that whatever your theology is, and still there's someone to look up to.
Exactly. I think leadership should reflect those you're leading. So let's just talk about a stage in a church. If you're expecting if your congregation's sitting there and just seeing 12 men on stage, it's not a reflection of the congregation. I think it also goes with age as well. You should have young, you should have old. You should reflect those leading the congregation that they're serving. And I guess in business, I would try to do the same thing.
Yeah, Jasmine asked a question, which was, is there an issue? Her question, I won't read out the whole question, but the idea of elevating women, does that diminish men? Is there a way of doing that where both are honoured in the process rather than saying, men step aside, women are going to do the job now? Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but that question wouldn't be asked in reverse. But anyway, let's discuss it, because I think it's a mutuality of respect. I belong to the Baptist World Alliance, and they have a statement that says we should promote on gifting, not on gender.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I think you can always find gifting in men and women. Again, men and women leading their audience, their congregation, their business are reflected in how they look as well. So I would say that it's just as important for women to celebrate men and to show respect and have mutual voice. I talk about sitting at the table, Karl. I'm assuming there's chairs for men and women at every boardroom table. So pull out a chair and take a seat. Yep. And I was saying this once to a group of women leaders, and one of them put their hand up, kind of reflected the mood of the meeting. But anyway, she puts her hand up and she goes, Karen, what if I sit down at a table, like you're saying, and they don't want me there? I said, honestly, just get up and move to another table, because there's so many that do want you there. Yeah. So if your posture is you default up, you expect that we will work together well, that you don't exclude one or the other, I'm hoping that men would feel just as celebrated as women, and neither would feel just tolerated. That's not where you want to be.
Interesting, isn't it? Steph kind of made that comment about you're not alone. Like, and there'll be people, on this webinar, as we've already said, people from across the country, different countries, and there's that whole Elijah, we're the only one left. Nobody cares. But you're saying across the globe, you're not alone.
Absolutely. And I think women feel this more keenly than men. Here's a really stark example, Karl. I was speaking with a group of people in Myanmar in the last 6 months, and that country's going through still civil unrest and war. And in the meeting, there was a prayer meeting. We were praying for that country. And there was this one girl who was one of the leaders on there. And I just said, hey, I'm going to stay on this Zoom meeting a little bit longer. And I invited her to stay. And I just said, hey, I wanted to talk to you. And I said those words to her. I just want you to know, she was the only woman out of the whole Zoom meeting of men. She was hiding in the jungle in Myanmar. And I said, I want you to know you're not alone. I see you and I'm standing with you. Well, it breaks something, Karl, when we actually feel that. It's that picture that we just showed. It's a side by side. It's a shoulder to shoulder. It's I'm with you. It's literally how it was meant to be in the Garden of Eden, Adam with Eve. Yep. And we've lost the with somewhere along the line, and we've just got all the Adams and all the Eves. I'm like, what if we bring back the with and we actually stand alongside well, and no one's alone?
Yeah, there's a number of questions coming through. I'm just looking to the left here because that's where I see the questions in the chat, and quite rightly and reasonably, there's all the questions about, so what about the biblical roles and men and women, and how have you navigated all of that? Because we haven't said that this webinar is going to deal with those issues. That's not to reduce them or say they're not important. That's just not the space that we're in. But how have you navigated through that argument? Because it's a serious argument, and both sides have got intellectual, thought-out positions on it.
I get asked by women this a lot, and I said, the bottom line is find where you can thrive. Now, for Stephanie, I love that she found where she can thrive, probably in a theological space that didn't quite match hers. Yes. Yet she can still be all she's meant to be. And I've found that over my lifetime too. I've not always been in free and egalitarian spaces that are very generous. So I say yes to places where I know I can thrive and I can be myself. And that would be my advice to any woman, any man, honestly. If you're in a space where you're constantly constricted because of a difference that you hold with somebody else, theologically, culturally, then it's probably not a space you can stay long term. But if you can grow and the organization can grow, when my husband and I were leading a church, we started in a church where women weren't even allowed to hand out the offering bag. Well, I really didn't even know at the time because I was busy with babies and it wasn't a big issue. And, we ended up co-senior pastoring that church because we all went on a journey together. And I thrived in the whole process. In fact, we all grew together. So I think the question is more, can you thrive? Then do so. But if you can't, then just find another space that will suit you.
There was the comment, and I'm just trying to remember who said it. Stephanie, no, it was actually Wendy, about talking with the principal of Winona School here in Sydney, talking about mentoring people. And if you're over 45, find someone to mentor. your thoughts on mentoring, because there's one thing of just gathering people together, which is what you're doing, which is fantastic. The kind of how do you see mentoring working? What's important there?
Yeah, you know that example I gave where can you be less? I had a minute to give my answer in that moment. And I remember thinking of 3 different things. But one of them was, I turned to the person asking me the question. I said, you know what? I have so many young women on my staff that I spend all my time resourcing, encouraging, equipping, and releasing. Please don't ever ask them to be less. And that's what mentoring is to me, Karl.
Yeah.
It's literally finding people to resource them, to encourage them, to equip them, and then release them into greater spaces. And then I then try and catch up with them and do it again. And then I catch up with them and do it again. In the next gen movement that's sweeping across our nation through the Global Leadership Network, literally it's about the emerging leaders, although the leader of that movement in our staff would challenge me. They're not emerging, they're the leaders of now.
Yeah.
But it's literally looking back, and that image that we showed you was literally women grabbing a hand of someone else, grabbing the other one. We're good at that, and we just bring them with us, and we don't lose focus. If we're not mentoring and coaching the generations behind us, we're only doing 50% of our leadership role.
Yeah, and in all of that, it's the whole angry, concerned, feeling dismissed. How do you? I think we talked about this earlier, but as we get toward the end of our hour together, how do you make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, for me personally, I've sought some really great counselling. So when I went through that dark night of the soul, probably if you sat most women leaders down, we've all got one of those. I just sought some great counselling. I thought I've got to work through this stuff. I did not want my pain to hold me back from my future. I surround myself with like-minded leaders that encourage me, men and women, and celebrate those moments as well. So I think speaking well, and then I just say to women leaders, and particularly those that I'm mentoring, hold a position of 2 pillars, strength and grace. So be strong, be all you're meant to be bold, show up, use your voice, but do it with an umbrella of grace, and have a merciful heart, and have a heart that's healed. You'll soon know it if it's not. Go get it healed, do the work. And I would say the same for every leader on the planet, Karl, men and women. You can tell the ones that are broken and leading out of brokenness, or those that are wounded and the scars are still there, but they're leading out of health.
Yeah, and it's that makes sure you're leading out of health, because leading in a way that's sort of reacting to people is not helping the kingdom. It's not helping you. It's not helping the people around you. Is there, now in the end, when you were asked that question, you decided to move on. How do you decide that, okay, this is the wrong room, this is the wrong table, this is the wrong space? Because nobody wants to do that. We all want to change where we are, but how do you decide that it's the time?
You know, I'm never going to give up without a bit of a battle. So, I mean, I think you try hard. I don't think you give up easily. I don't think that's what leaders do. So I always think there's 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 ways to come at an issue, but you kind of know when you've exhausted all those ways, and you know when you're shrinking. You know, it does no one good to shrink and be less than you're meant to be. And even more so yourself. So I think when I find those spaces, and to be honest, I haven't actually had a lot of them, I think it's time to move out. But you know what? There's finances, there's family support, there's all sorts of issues at play here. It's not an easy decision. And some people have to stay. So if that's the case, then find somewhere to thrive outside of the main area that you're struggling with. So if it's a workplace, then find a church where you thrive in. If it's a church, find a community you thrive in. I don't know the perfect life while we're here on this earth, but I think if your soul is shrinking, then there are decisions to be made, and make them courageously.
Wow. Good on you, Karen. And thank you for your input. We just really appreciate the work that you're doing, your ministry, and your insights today, and giving us your time today. So thank you. For everybody that's been with us from across the country and internationally, it's wonderful to have you with us, whether you've been live or you're now watching the replay. 2 things as we wrap up. The first is just to remind you that there's the YouTube channel, the Olive Tree Media YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to that. You'll get notified of all the videos that drop. This will be on the YouTube channel, as is a number of other things that we do, all sorts of interviews, extended interviews from all of our series, all there. Make sure you get those and continue to link with us as Olive Tree Media. And finally, it's in 1 month's time, it's the end of the financial year, and organisations around the country have an end of financial year appeal. And we as Olive Tree Media do that. You're able to come to this webinar for free. We try and do as much as we can for as little cost as possible. But as you can imagine, running a ministry like Olive Tree Media continues to need resources. We have lots of people from across the country to support us. If you can help do that, you can support through a tax-deductible donation through the Joshua Trust, and that's a huge help for us. I want to thank the 4 fabulous women who are been on this webinar today, with a bloke limping along next to them, for Karen's input, which has been wonderful, for Stephanie Judd at City on a Hill Church, for Wendy Simpson, a corporate leader, an Order of Australia medal holder, just a wonderful leader, and for Ainsley and her interviewing skills on both of those, and who's on our team as communicating and communications and marketing, a huge part of our team. And so we really appreciate their work. We thank you for being with us, and we trust that you'll continue to link with us as Olive Tree Media as we seek to serve the community and make a difference for Jesus across this nation. Thank you.